Vermont Humanities Council, and we co-hosted the library and the Norwich Historical Society. First Wednesdays is supported statewide by the Elma Gibbs Donchian Foundation, National Life Group Foundation, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Vermont Department of Libraries. Tonight's talk is also generously underwritten by Otto and Associates. The Historical Society and the library would like to thank our underwriters for their generous sponsorship of First Wednesdays. And they are the Boatwright Foundation, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Mascoma Savings Bank, Norwich Square Properties, and Jane W. Stetson and E. William Stetson III. Tonight's speaker, Randall Balmer, is the Mandel Family Professor of Arts and Sciences and Chair of the Religion Department at Dartmouth College. Before coming to Dartmouth, he was Professor of American Religious History at Columbia University for 27 years. He has been a visiting professor at Princeton, Yale, Northwestern, and Emory Universities, and in the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He was a visiting professor at Yale Divinity School from 2004 to 2008, and he earned his PhD from Princeton University in 1985. Balmer, an Episcopal priest, is the author of a dozen books, including God in the White House, How Faith Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. His second book, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America, now in its fourth edition, was made into an award-winning three-part documentary for PBS. Professor Balmer was nominated for an Emmy for writing and hosting the series. His latest book is The Making of Evangelicalism, From Revivalism to Politics and Beyond. Please join me in welcoming Professor Randall Balmer.
I want to talk a little bit about evangelicalism today and talk about the origins of the term, the various groups within that larger umbrella that I'll describe a little bit later, and talk a little bit about the history of evangelicalism in America, how it's unfolded throughout American history, and if we have time, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the 2016 presidential election, if you can bear it. First of all, the term evangelical actually, and by the way, let me talk about pronunciation. Evangelical, some people say economic, some people say economic, don't worry about it. I tend to gravitate toward the American pronunciations rather than the British, so I use the term, or pronounce the term evangelical. The term evangelical actually comes from the New Testament. It's a reference to the first four books of the New Testament, written by the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the term evangelical refers properly to the gospel or the good news that is contained in the New Testament. In the 16th century, we're jumping very quickly ahead, the term evangelical came to be associated in particular with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation in light of his so-called rediscovery of the gospel, trying to rescue Christianity as he understood it from a lot of the corruptions and accretions of medieval Catholicism. So the term evangelical came to be associated very much with Protestantism in the 16th century. To this day, Protestant churches in Germany are known as Evangelische, so that's where the term, that's the association of the term. In America, however, in North America, the evangelicalism as we know it came about from the confluence of three strains, what I call the three P's. One of them was from Puritanism, New England Puritanism. The second is from Scots-Irish Presbyterianism. And the final P was Continental Pietism. And those three P's came together in an event that historians call the Great Awakening, which swept through the Atlantic colonies in roughly the 1730s and 1740s, to some degree into the 1750s, especially in Virginia. And it brought together these three different disparate strains at that point into a movement that I think is identifiably evangelical to this day. This is the era of the itinerant preachers. People like George Whitefield, who was actually an Anglican priest, came over to the American colonies in the 1730s, 1740s, traveled all over the Atlantic coast. He was a very effective preacher. He had been trained in the London theater, so he knew the importance of dramatic pauses, and using his stentorian voice and grand gestures. And in an era, in a culture that at that time had no theatrical tradition, he was very, very effective. Contemporaries said he could bring tears to your eyes simply by saying Mesopotamia. He was that effective as a public speaker. And he helped to bring about this confluence of the three Ps. I think it's possible today to look at evangelicals and the contemporary scene and see remnants of each of these Ps. I think from the Puritans, evangelicals have inherited a sense of the importance of introspective piety. The Puritans, as you know, were always keeping journals or diaries that charted their progress toward heaven, much like John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, that took full account of all of the distractions and all of the temptations that lay in the path of the believer. So evangelicals today are always kind of looking inside, taking their spiritual temperature, trying to assess how godly they are, what they need to do in order to be more holy. I think from the Presbyterians, evangelicals inherited a sense of the importance of doctrine or doctrinal precisionism, making sure you hold the right beliefs. And I can attest to the fact that seminary jobs are won and lost over the tiniest little theological minutia, because evangelicals, a lot of them think that these things are quite important. And I think finally from the pietists, evangelicals inherited a sense of the importance of an affective, warm-hearted piety. It's not enough merely to have the right doctrines or the right beliefs, but you have to be able to feel it. You have to be able to internalize it and have this affective or emotional spirituality as well. So these three Ps came together in the First Great Awakening, or as it's called by historians, and then we go to the American Revolution, and then there's another huge revival that takes place in the decades surrounding the turn of the 19th century that historians rather unimaginatively call the Second Great Awakening. And this convulses three different theaters of the new nation. Here in New England, emanating primarily out of Yale College, where there was a revival, believe it or not, in 1802. And what happened was that as these graduates of Yale began to fan out into parishes or churches like this one throughout New England, they brought with them a revival fervor, and this triggered a revival in the early years and decades of the 19th century. I've read through newspaper accounts about revivals in places like Woodstock, Vermont, and believe it or not, even in Hanover, New Hampshire, during this era of the Second Great Awakening. The second theater of the Second Great Awakening was in the Cumberland Valley of Kentucky, an area recently opened for settlement by the Louisiana Purchase. And this is the era of the great enthusiastic camp meeting revivals, where people would come from rural areas, sometimes from great distances, for a week or 10 days, preaching, hymn singing, conversions, all sorts of talk about holiness. This is the area of quite enthusiastic, ecstatic religion. Even though critics claim that more souls were conceived than converted in some of these camp meetings, it was a place of great revival and spiritual enthusiasm. And I think even to this day, the South bears the stamp of the Second Great Awakening and these camp meeting revivals that were present throughout the South. And by the way, camp meetings are still going on in the South and in other places of the country. The third theater of the Second Great Awakening took place in upstate New York, in an area that was recently opened for settlement by the construction of the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. And this is the area that was a place of social unrest, a great deal of growth, economic growth, demographic growth. And in this area, there were a series of revivals that began to break out, so much so that this area became known as the burned over district, because the fires of revival had swept through so frequently in that area. This is also where probably the most famous evangelical of the 19th century was active, a man by the name of Charles Grandison Finney, who was born in Warren, Connecticut, and later became a Presbyterian minister and was stationed out in western New York or upstate New York. And he's the person responsible for a lot of the development in evangelical theology, and particular social action in the early part of the 19th century. And I want to spend a moment on this because I think it's important for understanding where we stand today in terms of the evangelical movement and the evangelical subculture, as I call it. We think of evangelicalism today, I expect most of you would probably, if I did a word association, would talk about the religious right, would talk about the 2016 election, would talk about people like Jerry Falwell perhaps, or Richard Land, or Jerry Falwell Jr., or Franklin Graham, and so forth. But if you look back in this era, in the antebellum period, the early part of the 19th century, you find a very, very different focus to evangelical activism. Evangelicals were active in trying to make the world a better place, trying to reform society according to the norms of godliness. So they were active, for example, in the abolitionist movement, trying to bring an end to slavery. They were active in various peace crusades. I've even run across an instance of evangelical support for a campaign of gun control in the 19th century. I'm not kidding you about this. Evangelicals were also active in prison reform, the whole idea of a penitentiary, a place where a felon could not merely be segregated from the rest of society, but could become penitent and thereby constructively at some point in the future rejoin society. Evangelicals were active in the temperance movement. We think of temperance today as this kind of paternalistic, overweening movement, but in the early part of the 19th century, alcohol abuse was a very real problem. Alcohol consumption was way out of control. Americans drank alcohol before meals, during meals, and after meals. 3 meals a day. Benjamin Franklin opined that if God had intended man not to drink wine, he would not have given him an elbow capable of raising a wine glass. Water was thought to be good for navigation and little else. So alcohol abuse was rampant. And with it, of course, the attendant problems of spousal abuse and child abuse. And evangelicals took the lead in trying to temper Americans' consumption of alcohol in the early part of the 19th century. Evangelicals were actually also involved in women's rights, including the radical proposition that women should be allowed to vote alongside of men. This was the evangelical social agenda in the early part of the 19th century, extending, by the way, into the early part of the 20th century with the campaigns for workers' rights, supporting the rights of workers to organize and such. Well, what happens? What happens is that over the course of the 19th century, a lot of the optimism about the perfectibility of society begins to fade, beginning with the Civil War. The carnage of the Civil War alerted evangelicals to the fact that, well, maybe we're not building the kingdom of God here on earth as we thought we were. You're looking at the devastation. And by the way, historians, the latest rough estimates for the casualties of the Civil War are 750,000, 750,000 casualties. Compare that to American casualties in Vietnam, 58 or 59,000, certainly regrettable. I'm not trying to diminish that, but compare the two. The Civil War was a devastating event in American history, as I'm sure you all know. Later in the 19th century, you had the phenomena of urbanization, industrialization, and in particular the influx of non-Protestant immigrants who did not share Protestant scruples about temperance. And so evangelicals, by the end of the 19th century, are beginning to rethink their understanding of what they were doing in the social sphere. And many of them glommed onto a new mode of biblical interpretation called dispensational premillennialism. Don't get worried about the term here. The payoff for that term is that Jesus is coming back at any moment. Whereas before we thought we were constructing the kingdom of God here on earth, now we believe, according to our reading of the scriptures, particularly the book of Revelation, that Jesus is coming back at any time. And that, of course, had massive effects on how you understand society and how you view the task of social reform. If you believe that Jesus is coming back at any moment, why worry about educational systems? Why worry about even the temperance movement? Why worry about trying to reform society according to the norms of godliness? Because our time here is brief and transitory. The best thing to do is make sure your own lives are in order and wait for Jesus to come and bring you out of this situation. I'm going to pause, redirect for a moment, and talk about different understandings of what evangelicals are, that is, the variations within this movement. To define this movement, I usually talk about, and then I'm going to come back to the 20th century. To define this movement, I think you have three characteristics. First of all, an evangelical is someone who believes that the Bible is God's revelation to humanity and therefore should be taken very seriously and even, when possible, interpreted literally. So you have the impulse to biblical literalism on the part of evangelicals, although, as I often protest, evangelicals engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism when it comes to the Bible. But we all do, let's face it, and even people of faith do the same thing. But nevertheless, there's this impulse to understand the Bible as God's revelation to humanity and therefore must be taken very seriously. The second characteristic of evangelical is somebody who believes in the centrality of a conversion or a born-again experience. This comes from the 3rd chapter of St. John in the New Testament, when Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night, and he asks Jesus how he, Nicodemus, can be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. According to St. John, Jesus replies, "You must be born again," or in some translations, born from above. This is where the term born again comes from, and this is used widely by evangelicals to identify themselves as people who have had this conversion experience. For many evangelicals, if not most, that moment is a datable experience. It's a transformative moment that directs them away from sin to salvation, from darkness to light, from hell to heaven, to put it in the starkest terms. And they will be able to recount the circumstances surrounding their conversions, and often do so in front of their peers. The third characteristic of an evangelical is somebody who believes in the importance of evangelism, or bringing others into the fold. This is, of course, from the New Testament, at the end of Matthew, at the end of Mark. There is something that a lot of believers call the Great Commission, when Jesus tells his followers to go into all the world and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. My observation over the last 50, 60 years has been evangelicals talk about doing this a great deal more than they actually do it. They tend to hire professionals to do it for them, missionaries, and many of these mega churches will have evangelism ministers or outreach ministers on their staff in order to try to bring others into the faith. But nevertheless, an evangelical would most likely acknowledge his or her responsibility to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. So those three characteristics, the Bible as God's revelation to humanity, the centrality of a conversion or born-again experience, and the impulse to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. How large is this movement? When I first began studying it, the polling data suggested that it was somewhere in a range of 25 to 46% of the U.S. population would be in that category, would fit that definition. I think today the best information we have is about 1/3 of the population would fit this definition of evangelical. That is, that is a broad definition. And I use that as a kind of umbrella definition to describe evangelicalism. But I also want to spend a few minutes and talk about the variations within evangelicalism. That is to say, that within that movement or beneath that umbrella, there are different strains that are quite identifiable by their characteristics. So I want to begin with the holiness movement. The holiness movement actually comes out of this era of these Great Awakenings, the Second Great Awakening, particularly in the South. It's characterized by an impulse to try to reinvigorate the faith from its complacency. The particular focus in the 19th century was Methodism. By the middle of the 19th century, a lot of these holiness people thought that Methodists had become rather corrupt, become rather complacent. They had become middle class because, in part, they hired seminary-trained ministers for their congregations, some of them. Some of them had organs in their churches. Some of them even had, wait for it, robed choirs in their churches, which for a lot of these holiness people was a symptom of what's my best word here for? Moral decay and spiritual lethargy. And so they sought to reinfuse or reinvigorate Methodism with holiness principles. The primary venue they chose for doing so was various holiness camp meetings. Some of you are familiar with Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, the Oak Bluffs camp meeting ground. Some of you are familiar with Ocean Grove, New Jersey. Those were holiness camp meetings that were begun as a way to reinvigorate holiness people so that after their summer sojourns to the beach side, and I could talk about why the beach is important, it's a fascinating sort of excursus, they would go back to their Methodist congregations and try to reinfuse these Methodist congregations with a spiritual ardor that these holiness people thought had been lost over the course of the 19th century. What happens to holiness is that the Methodist bishops get real tired of this after a while, and so they effectively marginalize these holiness folks, and they go off and start their own denominations. The Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, for example. The Church of the Nazarene has its roots in the holiness tradition and so forth. So by the end of the 19th century, these holiness people are going off into their own institutions and their own organizations and are no longer part of Methodism per se, for the most part. So that would be one strain. Again, this is all evangelical, but this is holiness, a particular variant of it. And holiness people today are very concerned about issues of behavior, personal modesty. When I was writing Mine As I Sing the Glory, I was down in Holiness Camp meeting in St. Petersburg, Florida, for a week of meetings. And these folks had very, very strict codes for personal behavior. I was staying there, or I was spending a lot of time there. And one morning I decided between events to go out for a run, to go jogging along the beach. And I got back to the camp meeting. I was prepared to change back into my regular clothes, and one of the preachers pulled me aside and said, "We don't wear shorts here." So I had to comport with their standards. Women are not allowed to wear makeup, cosmetics, jewelry, and so forth. They're supposed to never cut their hair in their entire lifetime, so you see all these really interesting hairdos in these holiness gatherings. But it's all part of understanding themselves as being set apart for holiness, and that's the characteristic of the holiness movement. Out of the holiness movement comes the second strain I want to talk about, and this is Pentecostalism. Now, these are the folks you see on television with their arms upraised. It's a gesture of openness to the Holy Spirit. They believe in spiritual gifts, including divine healing and speaking in tongues. The modern iteration of the Pentecostalism really begins on New Year's Day, the first day of the new century, January 1st, 1901, in, of all places, Topeka, Kansas, at Bethel Bible College, where students at Bethel Bible College had been studying the New Testament and had been praying for the gifts of the Holy Spirit that had come down upon the early church as recorded in the second chapter of Acts. And after several days of praying, one of the students there, a woman by the name of Agnes Osman, began speaking in tongues, speaking in an unknown language under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And this was interpreted by the people there at Bethel Bible College as the baptism of the Holy Spirit that was promised in the New Testament in the 2nd chapter of Acts. And this triggers a whole movement within evangelicalism called Pentecostalism. It spreads from Kansas down to the upper Midwest and down into Texas. There, an African-American man by the name of William Joseph Seymour takes this Pentecostal message out to Los Angeles, and he's responsible more than anyone else for this great revival called the Azusa Street Revival. It took place at 312 Azusa Street beginning in April of 1906. From there, these nightly meetings are actually 3 times a day meetings in the Azusa Street Tabernacle, where you had all sorts of divine healing and people speaking in tongues. People affected by the Azusa Street Revival began to fan out across North America and eventually around the world, bringing with them their Pentecostal message with the centrality of speaking in tongues, speaking in this unknown language, as being part of the Pentecostal witness or the signs of a spiritual renewal. Another strain within evangelicalism would be fundamentalism. Fundamentalists take their name from a series of pamphlets that was published between 1910 and 1915, financed by Lyman and Milton Stewart of Union Oil Company of California. These pamphlets contain very conservative articulations of Protestant doctrines, meant to stanch the movement toward liberalism, or as it was known at the time, as of modernism within Protestant groups, particularly Northern Protestant groups, in the early decades of the 20th century. Those who subscribe to these doctrines on the issue of biblical inerrancy, for example, the Bible is entirely without error, the virgin birth of Jesus, the authenticity of miracles, the resurrection of Christ, as well as Christ's soon second appearing here on earth, those folks who subscribe to these doctrines came to be known as fundamentalists. That's where the term comes from. It has since been applied more broadly to talk about Hindu fundamentalism or Jewish fundamentalism or certainly Islamic fundamentalism. Even I would contest Buddhist fundamentalism, but that's another topic. But the term properly belongs to this movement within American evangelicalism that began to take form in the early part of the 20th century. What's the difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist? Jerry Falwell himself said that a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's mad about something. And it's a pretty good definition because it speaks more to temperament rather than to real precise differences in doctrine or other sorts of characteristics. So that would be another strain within this, or beneath this broader umbrella of evangelicalism: holiness movement, Pentecostalism, fundamentalism. Another strain would be something called New Evangelicalism or Neo-Evangelicalism. Pardon me. This emerges in the middle of the 20th century, primarily through the agency of Billy Graham. Billy Graham, who of course just passed away a few weeks ago, Billy Graham was notable for the fact that he, at an early stage in his career, rejected the narrow, constricted, militant fundamentalism of his childhood in favor of a broader, more capacious evangelicalism. His son, by the way, has done the opposite, but that's another story. That is to say that Graham was part of this movement that rejected a lot of the militancy and the separatism of fundamentalism, so that Graham, throughout his career, cooperated with other religious leaders. He didn't summarily reject Catholics as being non-Christian, as many fundamentalists would do, by the way. He cooperated with other religious leaders, with Jewish leaders, for example. In the early part of the 90s, I did a documentary for PBS on Billy Graham. And I knew that a lot of fundamentalists regarded Billy Graham as a flaming liberal, and believe me, they do. And so I wanted to interview one of them for the documentary. So I sent a letter to Bob Jones Jr. of Bob Jones University. And actually, Billy Graham had studied for a semester at Bob Jones, at that time college, Bob Jones College, before he transferred away from it. And I thought perhaps Bob Jones would be interested in talking about Billy Graham on camera. And I got this very terse letter in reply, which I have somewhere in my files. It said, "Dear Mr. Balmer, I don't know how to tell you I haven't the slightest interest in talking about Billy Graham other than to say what I just said. Yours sincerely, Bob Jones Jr." And so I tried another fundamentalist, and he didn't want to talk about Billy Graham, and his reason was I was doing this project for PBS, and PBS was a communist front, so I didn't get anywhere. But the fundamentalists, they're still around. They hate Billy Graham because he cooperated with other non-fundamentalists, and so they thought that he would compromise his faith. But that was the characteristic of evangelicalism, of neo-evangelicalism, is that it was much more irenic, much more capacious, and Billy Graham really was, in many ways, certainly the symbolic leader of that movement, but in many ways the real leader of that movement as well. There are other groups that we could talk about as well. I'm looking at the time here. There's a growing group of Hispanic evangelicals who are gravitating toward evangelicalism and away, many of them, from the Catholicism of the countries where they had left or their parents had left. This is a very interesting movement. It's a growing movement. It's one that cannot be characterized politically in any simple way. Similarly to African American evangelicalism, again, there's a long history, a long tradition of African American evangelicals going back to the days of slavery, but because of the persistence of racism in this country, it has had, for the most part, very little intersection or commerce with white evangelicalism, and so in many ways is a movement somewhat apart from the larger tradition. And finally, I like to give the Southern Baptists their own little space. They kind of tend to stay segregated to some degree from other Protestants. They're folks who, for the most part, don't recognize themselves in the term evangelical. But I like to apply the duck test there, because if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. For the most part, Southern Baptists, especially since the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979, would fit into that category as well. So it's a movement that has some general characteristics, but it has very particular characteristics as well, depending on which strain of evangelicalism you're talking about. And by the way, I could expand that taxonomy a little bit more, but those would be the main groups within that larger umbrella or larger category of evangelicalism. Let's come back to the 20th century and try to move up at least into 2016. As evangelicals entered the 20th century, they were increasingly feeling besieged by a lot of the social and demographic developments that I described earlier: urbanization, industrialization, the arrival of non-Protestant immigrants. In short, they looked around themselves, particularly in the tenements in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and said, "We thought we were constructing the heavenly city of Zion, but it doesn't really look that way." And so that's when they began to glom on to a different mode of biblical interpretation that I mentioned earlier, called premillennialism or dispensational premillennialism, that held Jesus was coming back at any moment. And I can give you some examples of that a little bit later if you want me to expand on that. So in the early decades of the 20th century, they were feeling more and more under siege by what was happening in the larger culture. And in many ways, that all came together in Rhea County Courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee in July of 1925, the famous Scopes trial, where William Jennings Bryan faced off against Clarence Darrow in what was at that time, before O.J. Simpson, called the trial of the century. As you know from your history studies, William Jennings Bryan actually won the case. That is to say that he succeeded in convicting John T. Scopes of violating the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching of evolution in public schools. But evangelicals lost rather decisively in the larger courtroom of public opinion. And what happens after 1925 is that they begin to recede from public view. And they construct what I call the evangelical subculture, which was this vast and interlocking network of churches, denominations, Bible camps, Bible institutes, Christian colleges, seminaries, publishing houses, missionary societies that provided for them a refuge from the larger world, the larger society that they had come to regard as both corrupt and corrupting. This was a place of safety, especially for their children, so that it was possible in the middle decades of the 20th century to grow up within that subculture and have very, very little commerce with anyone outside of that world. And I can attest to this personally. This was the subculture that they constructed in earnest in the middle decades of the 20th century, roughly from the Scopes trial of 1925 until the middle of the 1970s. What happens in the 1970s? In November of 1973, there's a gathering of 55 evangelical leaders at the YMCA on Wabash Street in Chicago. And they come together and they, over several days, hash out a document that they all sign called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And I invite you to read it for yourself. You can find it on the internet. Look for the 1973 version, Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And it's a remarkable document because it really represents a recrudescence of the social agenda of 19th and early 20th century evangelicals. So, for example, they decried the persistence of racism in American society. They talked about the growing gap between the affluent and those who were less affluent in American society. They decried the persistence of hunger in a society of such affluence. They talked about the dangers of militarism. This, of course, was right toward the tail end of the Vietnam War, so it was very much on the minds of many people. But they also reaffirmed their support for women's rights and women's equality. A remarkable document. Within 6 months of the Chicago Declaration, in Albany, Georgia, there was an event at the University of Georgia Law School called Law Day, which celebrates the graduating students in the law school. And it's a tradition on the part of the students to invite very prominent individuals to come and address them on Law Day. Senators, attorneys general, Supreme Court justices, and so forth. And at this occasion, in May of 1974, there was an invitation extended to the senator from Massachusetts, Edward Kennedy, who came to talk about the importance of the impeachment proceedings that were then proceeding through the House of Representatives that, of course, eventuated in Richard Nixon's resignation in August of 1974. The undercard speaker for that event was an evangelical Christian, also the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who talked about his understanding of justice. And he credited 2 theologians for his understanding of justice. One of them was the venerable theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who famously said that the sad duty of politics was to establish justice in a sinful world. And Jimmy Carter talked about how Niebuhr's ideas had become very important to him as he sought to be governor, to be a politician generally, but in particular in his duties as governor of Georgia. And then he credited a second theologian, the venerable theologian Bob Dylan, for his understanding of justice. particularly Dylan's song, Ain't Gonna Work on Maggie's Farm No More, about the plight of tenant farmers. He went on to talk about the importance of justice, the importance of standing up to entrenched interests, the importance of ensuring that those who are running the regulatory agencies in Washington, D.C. are not people by those who come from the industries they're supposed to be regulating. Imagine that. And in the midst of his remarks, he noticed that one of the journalists covering the event had left the building briefly and returned. And initially he thought that Hunter Thompson of Rolling Stone magazine was going out to the parking lot simply to refresh whatever adult beverage he was consuming that day. But it turned out that Hunter Thompson, as he later described many times, was going to his car to fetch his tape recorder to record something extraordinary. A politician willing to tell the truth, willing to take on entrenched interests. And Hunter Thompson's endorsement of Carter in the 1976 election went a long way toward legitimating his bid for the Democratic nomination and eventually for his election to the presidency. Well, you know the rest of the story. Jimmy Carter, of course, announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination in December of 1974 and headed out to the precincts of Iowa and the small towns of New Hampshire and began retail campaigning that eventually led to his nomination as the Democratic nominee for president and finally his election as president. He would have been elected by a far greater margin had he not given the Playboy interview where he talked about lusting after women other than his own wife. A boneheaded move, as he has since acknowledged. Lucinda was kind enough to mention my recent books, but one of the recent books is after that, after what you mentioned, was a biography of Jimmy Carter called Redeemer. And Jimmy Carter lost 15% in the polls after the Playboy interview came out and barely squeaked to election in 1976. Well, what happens? And here's the real important part for our understanding of evangelicalism, and in particular the 2016 election. It is during Jimmy Carter's presidency that this movement of evangelicals that we call the religious right mobilized against him. The standard narrative, of course, is that the religious right was activated as a political movement in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. In response to this, people like Jerry Falwell and others were so morally outraged, they decided to mobilize in order to reverse this terrible travesty. It's a great story. It's been repeated many, many times over the decades. It is also utter fiction. Roe v. Wade had nothing to do with the rise or the emergence of the religious right. The religious right did emerge in response to a court ruling, but it was not Roe v. Wade in 1973. It was a lower court ruling in the District Court, District of Columbia, in a case called Green v. Connolly. My time is running out, but quickly what happened in Green v. Connolly is that some parents down in Holmes County, Mississippi, were distressed that in the first year of desegregation in Holmes County, the number of white students in the school district dropped from over 700 to 28. The second year of desegregation in Holmes County, the number of white students in the public schools dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 church-sponsored segregation academies, applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. And these families in Holmes County, Mississippi, said, this doesn't seem right to us. They filed suit to block that. It's a longer process than I have time to get into, but what happens is that this suit was joined with another suit in a case called Green v. Connolly that came to the District Court, District of Columbia, and on June 30th, 1971, that district court ruled that any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not by definition a charitable institution. Therefore, it has no claims on tax-exempt status. That was the catalyst for the activism of people like Jerry Falwell, who, of course, had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia. Had nothing to do with abortion or with Roe v. Wade. Throughout most of the 1970s, evangelicals viewed abortion as a Catholic issue. They weren't interested in it. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach an anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978, more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. As the IRS began to enforce that ruling, it targeted several schools, including a fundamentalist school in Greenville, South Carolina, called Bob Jones University. And that is what really got the attention of these evangelical leaders, and that is what molded them into a political movement in advance of the 1980 presidential election. I'll play a little game here with dates for you. Bob Jones University lost its tax-exempt status on January 19th, 1976. In the 1980 presidential campaign, the religious right and the Reagan-Bush campaign blamed Jimmy Carter for the loss of tax-exempt status at places like Bob Jones University. I see some of you have gotten that already. January 19th, 1976 actually was an important day in Jimmy Carter's life, but it had nothing to do with the IRS or Bob Jones University. That was the day he won the Iowa precinct caucuses on his way to the Democratic nomination. He didn't become president until a year and a day after Bob Jones University lost its tax-exempt status, and yet people like Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell blamed Jimmy Carter for what happened at Bob Jones University. Well, I'm pressing the limits of my time here. I promised to say something quickly about the 2016 election. As you know, 81% of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump in this last election, the family values candidate. Actually, I was looking at some statistics today, and I saw that only 61% of Mormons supported Donald Trump in 2016, which is interesting. So the question is why? Well, I have several answers for that, at least after some time thinking about that. But I've come down to 3 reasons why I think that's the case. I think the first reason, and arguably the most important reason, is that for years, as you know, the religious right has been vilifying Hillary Clinton. And I think that many evangelicals just couldn't imagine themselves voting for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election because she had been so demonized over the decades by leaders of this movement. I think the second reason is that Donald Trump excels in what I call the rhetoric of victimization. Now, it's always about him, of course, but evangelicals respond to that. They respond to the arguments that their views are under attack, that they're the ones who are the minority, they're the ones who are struggling to maintain their religious freedom in the face of some kind of overwhelming bureaucracy or deep state or whatever the language might be. So I think that figured into it as well. But in light of what I just said about the origins of the religious right, I also think that what happened in 2016 is that the religious right finally dropped all pretense that this was a movement about family values. And these voters returned to the charter founding of their own movement that is very much involved in racism. Now, I have to say that this is an interpretation that I've been trying to fight for much of my career, that evangelicals are racist. And I think that statement certainly needs nuance, nevertheless. But the fact that they responded in such overwhelming numbers in the 2016 campaign to what was clearly, I think, to most observers, a campaign steeped in racism hardly absolves them from the charge of racism themselves or the movement being steeped in racism. So I will leave it there. I'm gone over my time, I'm sure, but thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.